Aaliyah sold somewhere between 24 and 32 million records. For about 20 years, if you opened Spotify, typed in her name, and went looking for the 2 albums that actually made her famous, you would not find them. 1 in a million was not there. The album simply called Aaliyah was not there. The only full record of hers you could play was her very first one, made when she was 15, before she became the artist the world remembers. She was one of the defining voices of 90s and early 2000s contemporary R&B, the blueprint a whole generation of singers would copy. The artists who came after her spent years openly trying to recreate the sound she and her producers had invented. And during the exact stretch of years when streaming quietly turned old music into one of the most valuable asset classes on Earth, her catalog earned almost nothing. The reason had nothing to do with grief, and nothing to do with any of the darker theories people like to attach to her name. It was narrow and legal, and it has almost nothing to do with the story you have probably already heard about her. It comes down to a single question: who owned the tapes? To understand how a double platinum, RIAA certified catalog can vanish in plain sight, we have to follow the recordings themselves. Who held the rights to them? Why they went dark for 2 full decades? What that silence actually cost as far as anyone can measure it? And who is quietly making money off her voice right now? Not one of those 4 answers runs through the person you would expect. None of them runs through her family. Start with the man at the center of it. Barry Hankerson, her uncle. Before any of this, he had been a community organizer in the Detroit mayor's office, and for a while he was married to the singer Gladys Knight. In 1993, after the major labels passed on his teenage niece, he started his own label to put her music out himself. He called it Blackground. Her first album came out in 1994, distributed through a label called Jive. 2 years later, that arrangement ended, and Hankerson made the decision that quietly shaped everything that followed. He signed Blackground's distribution over to Atlantic, but he kept the masters. The masters are the actual recordings, the things that get streamed and licensed, the asset that holds almost all of the long-term value. Keeping them was the smart move, the move a sophisticated operator makes. From 1 in a million forward, Hankerson owned Aaliyah's recordings outright. And there is a second layer underneath that, one most people never think about. Aaliyah did not write her own songs. In the music business, the person who writes the song owns the publishing, and the publishing generates a completely separate stream of money from the recording itself. To be precise about what that means in practice, when a song gets played, there are 2 distinct royalty streams running at the same time. Master royalties flow to whoever owns the recording, in this case, Blackground. Songwriter royalties, the publishing side, flow to whoever owns the composition. Because she was the voice and not the pen, that side was never hers either. So when we hear today that her family protects her legacy, her mother Diane, her brother Rashad, we have to be precise about what they actually control of her recorded music. The masters belonged to Blackground. The publishing was administered through Blackground, and later through Reservoir Media. What the family owns of the songs that made her immortal is, in plain legal terms, close to nothing. What they do own is her name and her image, the right to her likeness. That is a real asset, and it is the reason a makeup line or a biopic still needs their blessing. But a name is not a master recording. The thing that actually gets streamed, the thing that pays out a little every single time someone presses play, sat entirely on the other side of that line. That is the first piece. It is also the piece that makes the next 20 years possible. In 2001, Aaliyah died in a plane crash in the Bahamas. She was 22, and it is worth sitting for a moment with where she actually stood at that exact moment, because it tells you how much was about to be frozen. Her self-titled third album had come out only weeks earlier and sold about 187,000 copies in its first week, the biggest sales week of her entire career. The week after the crash, that album did something almost no record ever does. Instead of falling down the chart, it climbed. It jumped from number 19 all the way back to number 1. It was the first album to top the American chart after an artist's death since John Lennon, more than 20 years before. This was not a fading act whose catalog nobody would miss. This was a voice at the absolute peak of its commercial power. Within weeks of her death, the international distribution deal that third album had been riding on, a joint venture with Virgin, fell apart. Blackground moved from one major distributor to the next, over to Universal, then to Interscope, and each of those deals slowly wound down, too. By the time streaming arrived and became the way almost everyone on Earth listens to music, Blackground no longer had a working distribution deal at all. And that detail matters far more than it sounds, because the distribution deal is the pipe. It is the thing that physically delivers a catalog onto Spotify and Apple Music and collects the money that comes back. Without it, the music simply does not go up. Her catalog was not being hidden in a vault for some dramatic reason. It was stranded. The label that owned it had quietly stopped functioning as a label, and there was no longer anyone whose actual job it was to put Aaliyah online. One album escaped that fate. Her 1994 debut stayed available the entire time, for a reason that has nothing to do with art and everything to do with paperwork. That first album was owned by Jive, which later became part of Sony. It was never Blackground's to strand in the first place. So the single record of hers you could legally stream for 2 decades was the earliest one, the one she made at 15, before Timbaland and Missy Elliott built the strange, futuristic sound that actually turned her into Aaliyah. 1 in a Million alone had moved more than 3 million copies in the United States and earned RIAA Platinum certification. Songs like Are You That Somebody and Try Again, the records that made her the most forward-looking voice in 90s R&B, were gone. The work she had long since moved past was the only thing left standing. In 2012, Hankerson sold a stake in the publishing to a company called Reservoir Media. A fight over the distribution rights followed, and in 2015, a federal judge actually ruled on part of it. And still, even after all of that, the music did not come to streaming. That is the second piece. The third is the one nobody can hand you a clean number for. Here is the honest part, and it is the part the louder videos about this skip right over. There is no published figure for what the Blackout cost Aaliyah's estate in lost revenue. None. Anyone who gives you a precise dollar amount for that is making it up. What we can do is measure the shape of the loss, and the shape alone is bad enough. According to the industry's own tracking data, across the decade her catalog was offline. The entire Blackground library moved about 1.68 million equivalent album units, and a little over 1 million of those were Aaliyah's. That sounds like a real number until you understand where most of it actually came from. It came from fans uploading her songs to YouTube, unofficially, and other fans finding them there. A catalog that had once sold tens of millions of copies was, for the better part of 10 years, surviving on bootlegs. And there was a quieter cost that never shows up on any royalty statement. For most of the streaming era, an entire generation of listeners grew up with every other artist one tap away, and Aaliyah effectively missing. The most copied voice in modern rhythm and blues was slowly becoming the one young people could not actually find. Influence is supposed to compound. Hers was being quietly erased at the exact moment it should have been spreading the most. It is a dynamic that Taylor Swift identified publicly when she began re-recording her own masters after losing them in a separate deal. The same logic applies. If you cannot control the recording, you cannot control whether it reaches the next generation. For Aaliyah, there was no re-recording option. There was just the silence. And then there is the one number in this entire story that did not come from a press release. It came out of a courtroom, almost by accident, because the label that told the public nothing was forced to tell a judge something. In a dispute over distribution, a California appeals court affirmed an award to Blackground of $8.5 million in royalties. The court filing, entered into the public record as part of that appellate proceeding, broke that figure apart. $6.15 million of it was tied to the album Aaliyah. $2.64 million was tied to One in a Million. That is one of the only times the actual money those two records generated was ever written down anywhere the public could see it, and it surfaced inside a lawsuit, not a statement from the people who controlled them. Now set that beside what was happening to nearly every other catalog in those same years. Bruce Springsteen sold his to Sony for around $500 million. Bob Dylan sold his for more than $400 million. Justin Bieber, still in his 20s, sold his for roughly $200 million. Whitney Houston's estate, once it was run properly, started bringing in something like $8 million a year. And it was not just any catalogs climbing in value. The ones commanding the very highest prices were precisely the older ones, 10 years and up, the kind that had already proven they would be played for decades. Aaliyah's was exactly that kind of catalog. It just happened to be locked. By the middle of this decade, the valuation specialists who price these things put the average catalog they handled at around $19 million, with the strongest ones changing hands at more than 17 times what they earned in a year. A genre-defining, double-platinum body of work would have sat comfortably above that average. Hers earned roughly what a bootleg earns. That is the third piece, and that is the cost. The fourth is what happened when the freeze finally broke. In August of 2021, Blackground Records 2.0 came back, rebranded and relaunched, and announced a deal with an independent distributor called Empire to finally put the entire catalog online. One in a Million went up first, and what happened in the days around that release told you exactly who held the cards and who did not. The day before the rollout began, Aaliyah's estate, her mother and her brother, put out a public statement opposing it. They called it an unscrupulous endeavor that had been launched without their consent. They described 20 years of what they called shadowy tactics and deception happening behind the scenes. Their attorney said flatly that Blackground had failed to give the estate any regular accounting for almost 20 years, and that the family had only learned the catalog was being released after the deal was already done. But none of that could stop it, because none of it had to. Hankerson owned the masters. He did not need the family's permission to release the music, and so the music went up over their objection. And the moment it did, the demand that had been dammed up for 2 decades broke loose all at once. In the first 4 days alone, Aaliyah's streams in the United States rose by about 665%. One in a Million entered the Billboard 200 at number 10. It had never once charted that high in its life. 25 years after it first came out, and 7 full spots higher than it ever reached while she was alive, the album was suddenly a top 10 record. A few weeks later, the self-titled album came back too, re-entering the chart at number 13 and re-entering the British charts as well. The audience had been there the whole time. There had simply been no legal way to reach it, and you did not even need the music itself to see how much demand was sitting under the surface. Even while every important recording was frozen, the appetite for anything Aaliyah kept surfacing in strange places. In 2018, after a fan petition gathered tens of thousands of signatures, the cosmetics company MAC released an Aaliyah makeup collection. The full set sold out online within minutes of going live. The demand was never the question. The access was. Today, with the catalog finally available, she draws close to 7 million listeners on Spotify every single month. And Are You That Somebody has been played hundreds of millions of times. None of that was new. It had been waiting, with nowhere legal to go, for 20 years. That is the fourth piece. Except the catalog was not finished changing hands, and Aaliyah was not the only career that had gone silent inside this same machine. Think about JoJo. She was signed to Blackground as a child, 12 years old, and for a moment she was one of the biggest young pop artists in the country, with 2 hit albums behind her. Then her third album stalled. And stalled. Under a New York law that bars locking a minor into a recording contract for more than 7 years, her deal should have lapsed on its own. The label kept her anyway, neither releasing her new music nor letting her leave for years, until she finally went to court in 2013 and told a judge that Blackground had done irreparable damage to her career. She got out, but the damage ran deep enough that years later she had to re-record her own early hits from scratch, note for note, because the original recordings were trapped inside the same catalog nobody could stream. An artist forced to remake her own music just to be able to share it. If that sounds familiar, it is because it is the same trap that has swallowed names far bigger than hers, and the same logic that drove Taylor Swift to begin re-recording her entire early catalog after losing her masters in a separate dispute. Or think about Toni Braxton, whose own money story we have looked at before on this channel. Hankerson managed her first, then signed her to Blackground, where she released 1 album. In 2007, she sued him for $10 million, alleging fraud, deception, and double-dealing. The case settled. She handed back an advance, walked away from the label, and 3 years after that, she filed for bankruptcy for the second time in her life. There were others tangled up in it too, including a former partner of Hankerson's, who won a jury award of nearly $6 million, a judgment that Blackground itself agreed to guarantee, and then defaulted on. The pattern is the whole point. The frozen Aaliyah catalog was not a one-time tragedy that simply happened to follow a young woman's death. It was how this particular operation worked, applied to her the same way it was applied to nearly everyone who signed anywhere near it. So where does her music actually live now? Follow the ownership from the very beginning and count how many hands it passes through, and notice that not one of them is ever the family's. Jive, then Atlantic, then Virgin, then Universal, then Interscope, then Reservoir Media in 2012, then Empire in 2021. And in March of 2026, the publishing moved one more time to a new company called Legacy Publishing, built specifically around the old Blackground catalog, more than 800 songs, with Aaliyah's recordings among the crown jewels. That new company has already taken those old recordings and built 15 brand new songs out of samples drawn from them, tracks featuring artists like Drake and Party Next Door. And those releases have pulled in more than 726 million streams. Almost 25 years after she died, Aaliyah's voice is generating real money again, at enormous scale, on songs she never sang, and a balance sheet she will never see. It moves through a long chain of companies, the newest of which most of the people who love her music have never even heard of. And the family that has spent all these years guarding her name still does not own a single one of her songs.